"You should, Watson," said Holmes. "Tell your readers about the Stradivarius matter. It really does have certain aspects to it that lends itself towards your literary habits of embellishment." He returned to scratching on his own violin tunelessly. I turned to pen and paper and reached into my dispatch box for some notes I had made on the case he mentioned. For those regular readers of Sherlock Holmes cases, you might believe that every story began with someone bursting into our rooms at 221B Baker Street with a perplexing story to tell or problem needing unraveling, but this wasn't always the case. I recall that it was a glorious summer evening in early August 1895, and we had spent the day at the Old Bailey with myself as an observer and Holmes as a witness in the case against Patrick Cairns, in the sensational murder of Peter Carey. As we nodded our heads goodbye to Peter Carey's wife and daughter, Holmes and I decided on a gentle stroll back down Fleet Street. We watched the hacks bustling in and out of the offices like worker bees at a hive, churning out the stories that were like nectar to Holmes and his unquenching thirst for criminal misdeeds. And so onwards we walked towards town, buying some tobacco, and having worked up quite an appetite, we decided to stop at Simpson's in the Strand for a spot of supper. We sat in the upper room, and it was over the courses of julienne soup, filet de sole, spring chicken, and a dessert of charlotte russe. All the while Holmes perusing a copy of the London Evening Standard as I gazed outside at the pedestrians, cabs and coaches that filled the early evening air with that familiar cacophony of the city. When I looked up, I could see a glint in my friend's eyes. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. He looked up. "Watson, I believe that crime sometimes creeps in like the tide, slowly towards us, and inevitably. There are currently crimes happening many miles away, and mark my words, within a few months will be knocking on our door." He enigmatically refused to elaborate any further on the matter, and I quickly forgot, as Holmes told me of his plans to at least provide poor Patrick Cairns with some degree of comfort, with plans for a regular supply of tobacco and rum, whilst he awaited his execution at Newgate Prison. 2 months later found us both in our rooms in Baker Street, Holmes deep in a chemical analysis, and myself writing up notes on the recent cases that we had been involved with, including the peculiar incident involving the solicitor Hector MacFarlane, the case of the Colchester corpse, and the mysterious Hatton Garden jewellery thefts, to which Holmes solved without much effort, and to the extreme embarrassment of Inspector Lestrade, who had wrongly arrested a worker in one of the shops. The smells of cooking were wafting up the stairs, and I was just considering what culinary delights Mrs. Hudson would soon be bustling through our door with, when a loud knock came from the front door. Soon a dapper, stocky little man of around 50, with a prominent moustache, presented himself in our sitting room. He was carrying in his hands a violin case. He looked at both of us in turn and said in excellent English with a hint of an accent, "Mr. Holmes." Not looking up, my friend bid the gentleman to sit whilst he finished his experiment. I introduced myself, offered him a chair, and then we sat in silence for a few minutes until Holmes finally, with an exasperated sigh, set down a test tube and looked up and around at our guest. He gave a slight smile and said the most astonishing words to this man, clearly unknown to both myself or him. "I can see you were born in France. You have lived in England most of your life. You own a restaurant and have recently purchased a fake violin from a very fat man for an exorbitant price." The man and I both looked astonished, but he finally found voice and exclaimed, "It is all true, Mr. Holmes, but how can you know all of this?" Holmes shrugged off the question, and in reply said, "All I need to know from you is your name and what restaurant you own." "I am Monsieur Jacques Jonquet, the proprietor of the Café Bordeaux in Piccadilly." Please hand me the violin for examination whilst you tell myself and my partner your no doubt interesting tale. I poured the little man a brandy, lit his cigarette, and bid him to commence his story, whilst Holmes picked up a magnifying glass and prepared to examine the violin case. He said it was a busy evening service when a very fat man came and sat by himself eating. He had with him a violin case. Holmes interrupted him. Please describe him and his clothing precisely, Monsieur Jonquet. Monsieur Jonquet recommenced. He was around mid-30s, about 5'6", very fat with sandy-coloured hair that had started to thin at the temples and a well-spoken English accent. He wore a slightly tight-fitting but once fashionable black suit. When he finished his meal, the waiter presented him with the bill, and I could see the two having a conversation. The waiter then beckoned me to come over, which I did. The man, who said his name was Mr. Smith, said he had left his billfold in his nearby hotel. He asked if he would be excused to go collect it and offered to leave his violin as guarantee. He said it probably had no great value, but it had been left to him in his uncle's will and had just collected it, and that he was probably going to sell it, but that it certainly had a value more than commensurable to the meal. The little man, who had paused to look up at Holmes, then continued. His appearance and speech was that of a respectable Englishman, and I saw the violin inside was certainly worth more than the price of the meal, so I agreed to await his return. Sherlock Holmes looked up from his minute examination of the violin and said, "And then you met the tall, thin man?" Monsieur Jonquet again looked startled. "How could you?" He started. "Were you there?" Sherlock merely smiled, looked back to the violin and said, "Pray, don't let me interrupt your most illuminating story." Monsieur Jonquet took a moment or two to regain his composure, in which I offered to top up his brandy and again lit another cigarette for him. He began. It was just as Mr. Holmes said. Some 15 minutes after Mr. Smith had gone to collect his billfold from his hotel, when a tall, thin man came into the restaurant, inquiring to my best table for a party of 6 that forthcoming Saturday. I replied that. "Description, please," interjected Holmes, without looking up. He was a respectable, well-spoken gentleman, just over 6 foot tall and very thin, with short, brown, neat hair. He was beautifully dressed in a well-tailored dark blue Savile Row suit. My first impressions were that he was some sort of diplomat, very charismatic and used to getting his way in life. He paused and took a long drink of his brandy and continued. At this point, for the first time, the tall man seemed to perceive the violin case placed behind my station. He picked the violin case and opened it and said, "Oh my, is that what I think it is?" I can honestly tell you, Dr. Watson, that I had no idea what he was talking about. He then opened the case, turned the violin over, and murmured appreciatively. He asked me, "Do you know what you have here, my good man?" "No," I replied. "This is a Stradivarius. It is quite rare and," he said, lowering his voice, "needless to say, quite valuable. Would you be willing to sell it?" He then presented a card to me, which read. Holmes reached out a long, thin arm for the card, took and examined it underneath his magnifying glass. Holmes said, "Best quality paper, no other distinguishing features." He then handed it to me. I read aloud, "Percy Hill, expert in antiques and restoration, 12 Bruton Street, W.C." Holmes went back to the violin, which by this time he was peering inside the F-holes. I ushered Monsieur Jonquet to continue his extraordinary narrative, and he looked at both myself and Holmes before continuing. I explained to him that I would gladly sell it to him, but it wasn't mine to sell. I then explained to him about Mr. Smith, and of it being left in a will by his uncle. Mr. Hill then told me that he would have waited to buy the violin, but he had an urgent appointment and was already running late, with none other than a minor royal who wished to purchase a diamond brooch he owned. He then asked me to give Mr. Smith his card and told me to tell him to bring it around to his shop. He went on to explain that he hadn't had time to examine the Stradivarius in detail, but it was most likely to be the prize Molitor Stradivarius that had once been owned by none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, and if substantiated, he would offer the owner £4,000 for it. He then confirmed his table booking and rushed from the shop. Monsieur Jonquet then stopped, as Holmes had finished studying the violin and was staring at him intently. Holmes said, "Was that when you first started having thoughts of greed?" Monsieur Jonquet looked sheepish. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I admit that I thought if I could get what Mr. Smith thought of as an instrument of low value for a relatively small price and sell it to Mr. Hill, then I could open a second restaurant sooner than I had expected. I do admit a certain guilt, which continued until I saw Mr. Smith return about 20 minutes later to pay his bill. I did assuage my guilt by thinking that he would welcome a very good price on something he had gotten for free and didn't value. I also surmised that he would probably only sell it to someone who would recognize it for what it was and offer a fraction of what I would. Droplets of sweat had appeared on his forehead, and I repoured his drink for him, to which he swallowed half in one gulp, before continuing. I asked Mr. Smith to come to my office, and I told him that I had my granddaughter's birthday coming up, and that I wished her to take up an instrument. I explained that his visit had been perhaps fortunate, and perhaps he wished to sell the instrument. He explained that his uncle had had an eye for valuable items, and some of his other relatives had been left some valuable items. He admitted he had no use for the violin, but to his untrained eye it looked old, and he wouldn't accept less than £300. He had looked at me with such a look of hope, longing and cunning, that I would accept such a ridiculously high sum, that it led me to negotiate with him for form's sake. We agreed HTTPS:PR, with an exasperated sigh of, "My granddaughter must have it." I then went to my safe, withdrew the money and drew a receipt. When we had it witnessed, we concluded the transaction. He looked delighted, as though he had gotten the deal of the century, and quickly left before I could change my mind. For my own part, I couldn't tell you how delighted I was with myself. So much so that I took the violin home and spent the next few hours in front of the fire, just staring at this thing of beauty that had probably been owned by France's greatest hero. I couldn't wait to go to Mr. Hill's shop the next day. Once verified, I wouldn't settle for just £4,000. I wouldn't just accept his first offer. Oh, Mr. Holmes, I can't tell you the excitement I felt that evening. My friend chuckled. "And then when you went to the address in Brunton Street to find it wasn't there." "Yes, Mr. Holmes. How did you know?" Holmes replied, "It is my business to have an exact knowledge of London, and I know all of the shops in the West End, certainly enough to know that there is no antique shop under the ownership of a Mr. Percy Hill." Monsieur Jonquet looked dismayed. "Then what am I to do now?" My friend looked sternly at him. "You must learn a valuable lesson in life about greed. If something appears too good to be true, then it is. As for your money, it is gone. We will catch the men that duped you, and when we do, our fee will be a dinner at your fine restaurant at your expense. You, however, will at least have the pleasure of knowing these men face jail time, and you will appear as a witness to their trial." The little man said, "I agree, Mr. Holmes, but one thing I cannot see is how you knew all the facts about those men." I agreed with Monsieur Jonquet, but having known my friend for many years, I knew if he explained how he knew, it would be simplicity itself, and the illusion of magic would dissipate. how Holmes could see what others didn't ever cease to work its wonder on me. For people seeing it for the first time, it appeared like witchcraft. Holmes replied, "Don't worry how I knew. The important thing for you is that I do." And with those words, Monsieur Jonquet was swiftly ushered out of the room and downstairs by Holmes. I had many questions I wanted to ask of my friend, but I knew his habits of old. When he resumed his chair, he tucked his legs beneath him and silently proceeded to pack his pipe. It was a sure sign that he meant to meditate silently and reach a solution to a case I couldn't even grasp the beginning of. To keep my mind from dwelling on the matter, I reached for my favorite Clark Russell novel and quickly became absorbed in it. I must have fallen asleep, as when I awoke Holmes was gone, and I saw that Mrs. Hudson had left a plate of cold meats for me on the dining table. I didn't see Sherlock for the next 3 days, but breakfast on the 4th morning brought to Baker Street both Holmes and a welcome visitor in the shape of our friend, the rising figure of Scotland Yard, Inspector Stanley Hopkins, who was indebted to Holmes for helping solve a few of his cases, and, in turn, always kept him abreast of any developments or interesting cases at the Yard. I took the opportunity to congratulate Hopkins on his exploits in taking down Ezekiel Gottlieb and his young gang of pickpockets that had plagued the fashionable West End for many months, and whose capture I had read about in the newspapers. Hopkins replied, "Thank you, Dr. Watson, but I couldn't have done it without a little additional assistance." As he said this, he had looked up at Holmes. I then turned inquiringly to my friend, but he merely smiled and changed the subject. "Now, Hopkins, I require some assistance from the Yard. I would be most grateful if you could arrange for constables from each station, from Land's End to Dover, to call at each and every musical instrument maker and inquire if they have supplied an order of replica Stradivarius violins to either a very fat or thin gentleman in the past 6 months. I myself have visited every maker in London these past 3 days to no success." Hopkins replied, "Of course, but to what end, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes went on to explain about the curious case of Monsieur Jonquet, and I used this opportunity to finally ask, "By the way, how did you know one was fat and one thin, Holmes?" Holmes smiled and said, "You remember a few months ago I said crime was like a tide washing towards our shore? Well, thanks to news agencies, we will find the same stories printed in London as we would in far-flung places like Glasgow or Cardiff. I had been reading of a series of similar crimes perpetrated by 2 con men along the seaside towns of the south coast, and I knew that when the summer season was over, we would see this pair spring up in London." "You astound me, Holmes," I gasped. "So you were expecting them?" My friend replied, "Yes, and they will strike again soon, whilst the iron is hot. But remember, these are clever men, who will be on their guard with the wary senses of gazelles. However, our advantages are that they do not know we are on their trail, and also we know their modus operandi. That is French restaurants." Hopkins asked, "How will that help us, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes replied, "We wait like spiders and—" He raised an eyebrow. "No disrespect, Hopkins. I have my best men. Well, boys on the job." "You mean the irregulars, Holmes?" I asked. "Yes. As we speak, they have been sitting and watching across the road from all of the expensive French restaurants, selling newspapers, matches, and generally blending in invisibly, as though they were bricks in the wall for the past 2 days, collecting their usual daily fee and a guinea reward for the successful irregular who spots them. As soon as the fat man is spotted, they will telegram to me here, and I plan to hasten there and follow him back to his lair. Also, if you look outside, you will see Wiggins with his hansom waiting at my call." Wiggins was by this point a strong, weather-beaten young man of 24, tall and rugged, but with a quick wit and charm. He had outgrown the irregulars, but as to how he could have afforded a hansom at such a young age I did not know, but I rather suspect my friend was behind it. Moreover, I also suspect that it was to the great benefit of Holmes having a driver that knew every street as well as he did, but also to have access to every scrap of gossip and criminality that was happening within the city streets. He was currently hired exclusively for Holmes as he went about his investigations. I went to the window and saw him sitting upright at the driver's seat, smoking a pipe. Whilst observing this scene, I saw Mrs. Hudson taking him a mug of tea and a sandwich, which he rewarded her with a huge grin. Mrs. Hudson had grown exceedingly fond of Wiggins after he had finally learnt to remove his dirty boots before going up to see Holmes while still an irregular. She was delighted to see him move up in the world, and never missed an opportunity to mother him in his not infrequent appearances to Baker Street. After a pipe, Inspector Hopkins took his leave to return to Scotland Yard and send off instructions to the South Coast Police in the search for the violin maker. Holmes also asked him to keep a couple of strong constables free to assist when he had tracked down the two men's hideout. At 6 p.m, I was called to an urgent case from one of my nearby regular patients who was complaining of a recurring malady. By 7 p.m, I had reassured myself that it was a simple case, prescribed some medication and returned to Baker Street to find both my friend and Wiggins gone. My curiosity in the matter had led to such a distraction that I found myself unable to concentrate on anything for more than a minute. I stood by the windows smoking more than I usually allowed myself in a day. I paced back and forth in the sitting room. I tried to read a medical journal but barely took in a word. Would Holmes send for me? In a final effort to distract myself, I decided to take out and spend 20 minutes cleaning and oiling my trusty revolver that had certainly seen more action in London than it had ever in the Far East. Darkness had descended into Baker Street when I felt someone gentle shake me, and I awoke to find Holmes looking down on me. "Holmes, what time is it? What happened? Did you catch them?" "Watson, one question at a time, please. Come and have a seat by the fire whilst we light our pipes, and then I will give you a full account of the matter." We seated ourselves on our armchairs, and I waited till we had gotten our pipes alight. In a fug of smoke, Sherlock began. "About 20 minutes after you had gone, I received a telegram from young Johnston, who had been observing l'escargot in King William Street, near the monument, informing me that our fat man was seen to enter. Wiggins made excellent speed along the Euston Road and down the City Road, reaching our destination within 45 minutes of receiving the telegram. We arrived just in time to be told by Johnston that the fat man had left about 5 minutes previously. I paid Johnston and told him to wait and follow the thin man when he left. "And you went in to wait for the thin man to show up?" I asked. "Yes, I bid Wiggins to wait nearby and entered the restaurant. I sat at the nearest table I could find to the entrance and awaited the appearance of the thin man. There, within plain sight, was a familiar-looking violin case. The thin man didn't disappoint either, and some 10 minutes later he arrived, smartly dressed as Monsieur Jonquet described. His interaction took less than 5 minutes, and off he scurried. Almost if upon a stage production, a quarter of an hour later brought back the fat man, to whom the owner now treated like a long-lost relative, and off they went to a back office, doubtless to conclude a deal on the violin. He was soon back and straight back outside. I knew they would probably be meeting together nearby. I followed with a plan of myself tackling the thin man and Wiggins the fat man. One thing that area doesn't lack is plenty of policemen on the beat, so I knew there would be backup if required. Holmes stopped his narrative and took a long puff of his pipe while staring into the fire. And this is when the readers of your tales think I'm infallible. Why, Holmes? What happened? I asked. I told you, these two had senses for danger like prey. We followed the fat man almost until we almost reached the Bank of England, when he suddenly jumped into a cab. There was no sign of the thin man and Wiggins, and I had no time to return to his cab. I shouted for Wiggins to leave me, and I dashed for the nearest available cab. By the time we commenced, the other cab was about 200 feet in front and making haste. We kept this distance down past St. Paul's, up past St. Bartholomew's Hospital and past Smithfield. However, in Little Italy, my quarry discharged from his cab, slipped down an alleyway, and quickly became quite lost to me in the throng of people out in the evening London crowds. I curse my stupidity and can only hope Johnston was more successful than me. We had to wait about half an hour for our answer when there was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Hudson came up the stairs. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, there is a young boy to see you, and he is quite a dreadful sight. I have him lying on my chaise lounge. Please bring down your medical bag, Dr. Watson." At this she scurried back down to her rooms, and we quickly followed. Upon arrival, we found Johnston in quite the state described by Mrs. Hudson. He had a blackened eye and dried blood on his chin from a burst lip. Further examination thankfully showed nothing more serious than a missing incisor tooth and a few bruises that he would soon recover from. Johnston cried at the sight of Holmes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes. I followed him to the end of the street, and he turned into an alleyway. I hurried down the dark alley, and suddenly, there he was behind me and grabbed me. He demanded to know why I was following him. I didn't answer, and he bashed me proper, demanding answers. Luckily, a workman came down the alley at that moment, and he released his grasp on me. I took the opportunity and ran. It was quite the disappointing end to what had promised to be a very interesting case. As for the fat and thin men, they clearly knew someone was after them and simply vanished, no doubt leaving the metropolis well behind. The next few days brought Inspector Hopkins with further bad news, with a blank being drawn on the search for the violin maker. I wrote up notes for the case and put it in my ever-expanding folder of unsolved cases that myself and Holmes had been involved in. As Holmes said, whilst watching me write up those notes, "You really should write up all those unsolved cases, Watson. It would certainly burst that bubble of infallibility you have built around my exploits." Other cases came and went over the following year, including the St. James Park kidnapping and the Greenwich Naval case, which I may one day be allowed to publish. He didn't mention them again, but I knew my friend keenly scoured the papers every day for any news of his elusive conmen. We were sitting by the cosy fireplace in our rooms in the late autumn of 1896, the first wintry tendrils creeping across London, when we had a visitor bringing Holmes the most welcome news. This was Wiggins, and he burst into the rooms almost like the Wiggins of old. Mr. Holmes, you will never guess who I picked up in my cab at King's Cross Station this evening." "A very fat and thin man," replied Holmes. I looked on astounded, as I had almost forgotten that pair of rogues. "Yes, and I have the address that I took them to," replied Wiggins. "In Dean Street, near Soho Square." Holmes looked as delighted as I had ever seen him. "By Jove, what extraordinary luck, Wiggins. We cannot let them get away again. There is no time to lose. The game is afoot." With that, Holmes retired to his chambers, and within 10 minutes reappeared in front of us, a stock and trade British tradesman. "Now, Wiggins, take me to the address, and we will do some reconnaissance, Watson, my friend. Sometimes your assistance is invaluable, and other times a hindrance. In this case, it is the latter. You are far too conspicuous." With that, and a slight bow both he and Wiggins departed. For the next 3 days, Holmes did not return, and I had heard nothing from him. I kept myself busy with some medical cases and spent the evenings reading and writing whilst awaiting word from my friend. On the 4th day, I received a telegram from him asking me to be available that evening at 6 p.m. and to bring both my medical bag, a change of clothing for him and my revolver. This, I will admit, stirred my emotions, and by 5:30 p.m. found me watching the road in anticipation. When Wiggins arrived and we commenced our journey, I took the opportunity to grill Wiggins on the events since I had last seen Holmes. Wiggins explained that Holmes had managed to rent a room on the opposite side of the street from the duo's address in Dean Street. From behind a curtain, he was able to observe the comings and goings of the pair, but due to his previous experiences, he did not actively follow them. He did, however, have the irregulars placed outside every main junction and expensive restaurant in the West End. Wiggins left me at Soho Square, and quite the medical man with bag in hand. I walked to the address indicated. The door deftly opened, and Holmes guided me to a first-floor room which was entirely in darkness. We stood by the window and watched the scene across the road. He said, "They occupy the street-facing room on the first floor. I have been watching their comings and goings," he said, and produced a small telescope. He handed it to me and slightly moved the curtain, beckoning me to observe their lighted room. From here, we could see a scene which could almost be myself and Holmes. They were seated either side of a fireplace and both smoking cigars. The thin man was talking animatedly and gesticulating. The fat man was laughing at whatever was being said. Holmes explained, "They are quite set in their habits. They have lunch and dinner in a cafe in Old Compton Street, and will have a seemingly innocuous stroll thereafter. I know they have been casing high-class restaurants, and just this afternoon I saw the thin man return to their room with what appeared to be small packages under his arm. My hypothesis is that these will be their means of extracting monies from the greedy restaurant owners." I asked Holmes why he had not just arranged for the men to be picked up by Hopkins or Lestrade whilst dining at the cafe. He replied, "Watson, dear fellow, a medical man like yourself should know that the memory has a habit of forgetting, especially if time has passed. If we put either of these two men in a police lineup with other fat and thin men, show Monsieur Jonquet. Do you think he will pick them out over a year later? No, we cannot take the risk. I want to catch these felons red-handed." "So what's the plan, Holmes?" I asked. "Again we wait, dear Watson, we wait. And when they attend any one of the expensive West End restaurants which fit their usual modus operandi, we will be waiting." When at 7 p.m. we saw both of the men leave their room carrying a small wrapped-up parcel, Holmes sprung into action. "Watson, they have their prop. Now it's our chance to snare a couple of rabbits." He waited around 5 minutes and then sent a telegram message to Scotland Yard. Within 30 minutes, we found ourselves in the presence of Inspector Hopkins and 6 strapping young constables. "So we are finally to catch our men, Mr. Holmes," said Hopkins. "Yes, and I most certainly look forward to a conversation with that pair," said my friend. Holmes bid 2 policemen to stay by the windows in our room, and when the 2 men returned they should go to guard the front door, thus blocking off their means of escape. 2 further men were directed to the backyard, and the last 2 to remain on the second-floor landing. The expert locksmith, Holmes picked the door locks as easily as though he had used a key. Holmes, Hopkins, and myself soon found our way to the conmen's room, and noiselessly entered. Holmes, after days of watching, was well versed with the layout of the room, and our eyes quickly became accustomed to the darkness. We then sat in the chairs, which only an hour earlier had found the men we had been long searching for sitting and laughing, and began our wait. It was about 9 p.m., and in the silence I thought I heard the far-off chimes of Big Ben, when we heard the front door open outside and the sound of voices as they walked up the stairs noisily and in exuberant spirits. Holmes and Hopkins took position behind the door, and I behind the chair with my revolver in hand. The room door opened. The two men, one fat and one thin, walked into the room. As soon as the thin man had lit the room, both Holmes and Hopkins sprung into action. Holmes tackled the thin man to the ground, and Hopkins had only put his hands on the fat man, who immediately put both hands up in surrender. Hopkins blew a whistle, and suddenly the small room was full of Scotland Yard's finest, and the two men were quickly put in cuffs. "I told you we shouldn't have come back to London, Alfie," said the fat man to the thin man. "Shut up, Sam. Keep stum. They don't have anything on us," said the man called Alfie. Holmes bid Hopkins to seat the men, and looked at both in turn. He then addressed them. "Well, Samuel Turner and Alfred Jones, you have certainly led me a merry dance, but I have to tell you that your time is up. I know all about your games along the south coast, and can directly implicate you in 5 cases." And with these words he deftly reached inside Samuel's jacket and took out a bundle of £10 Bank of England notes. "Well, let's call that 6 cases," he said with a smile. Samuel Turner and Alfred Jones looked first surprised, annoyed, and then dejected. Holmes, who had only ever referred to them as the fat and thin man, surprised even myself, who knew better than anyone my friend's never-ending abilities to pull rabbits out of his hat. Holmes said next, "Men, the game is up. I have all the evidence to ensure you both serve long sentences. The only choices left to you is to give me a full account of your misdeeds, and Hopkins here will ensure you serve your sentence together and in the same jail cell. Otherwise, he will see to it that you are in different prisons and won't see your friend again." Sam looked at his accomplice and said, "The job's up, Alfie. We might as well tell him everything, and at least we get to stay together." A crestfallen Alfie looked at Sam, then Holmes, and just nodded. Holmes told him to begin from when they first met. Whilst Hopkins took out his notepad, Holmes poured the men a large whiskey from a decanter before Alfie began his story. "I was born into a bad family in Stepney, with my father and uncles always in trouble. By the time I was 16, I was well known to the local police and knew that if I stuck around, I would end up in the same place as my relatives. I moved to Brighton and got a job as a waiter in a good restaurant. It was here I met Sam, and as by this time we both learnt manners and had a talent for accents, we lost our jobs when some money went missing from a guest room. As Sam and I were such pals, we were both sacked, even though they didn't have any proof." He sat back in his chairs and asked if the handcuffs could be loosened slightly. Hopkins nodded and allowed a constable to do this. Alfie then continued. "Me and Sam played the 3-card Monte circuit for a while around London. We were good at it, so much so that local gangs would continually look to take a cut of our earnings, no matter where we plied our trade. We were also caught a couple of times and given a month inside the nick. We decided it wasn't lucrative enough or worth the hassle, and we decided that during the summer season we would target the greed of South Coast restaurant owners, and that's exactly what we did." Holmes said, "Yes, I was following your exploits, first in Plymouth, then Exeter, Bournemouth, Southampton and Portsmouth. You were clever by never staying in one place for too long. I knew that when the season ended you would probably be in London and were expecting you." Sam said his first words in this narrative. "So it was you who was following me from the restaurant in Monument?" Holmes nodded in affirmation. Sam somberly nodded in reply. Alfie said, "How is the boy?" I didn't mean to bash him up too much. I just wanted to find out who was following us. Holmes replied that all was well with Johnston, and that he was the only irregular not out in the streets for fear by Holmes that he would be recognized by Alfie, but he would no doubt be delighted to hear of the capture. I took the opportunity to ask, "What I don't know about Holmes is how you knew the names of these men." "Simplicity itself," answered my friend. "The day after I followed Samuel, I went to the yard and went through mugshots until I found a younger Alfred Jones and Samuel Turner. Sam, who by this time had found his voice, said, we quickly scarpered from London and made for Manchester and lay low for a few months. We played a few turns in Liverpool, Newcastle, Glasgow and Edinburgh, but then decided to get out of the game, and by that time we had almost enough to open our own restaurant. Alfie wanted to touch a couple more restaurants and argued that the heat would have died down in London, where the pickings were always bigger. I didn't want to, but we agreed on 2 last jobs then out. "Where have you stored the loot from your ill-gotten gains?" asked Hopkins. Alfie shook his head. "Sorry, Inspector, as we have no intentions to return to a life of crime once we finish our sentence. That money will be our nest egg that won't be given up. Threaten us as you may, it's safely hidden away." When further questioned, Alfie and Sam wouldn't elaborate either on the identity of the violin maker, citing that they didn't want to implicate an innocent man. Holmes shrugged. "A mere trifle." Alfie looked at Holmes and then Inspector Hopkins. "We have told you everything we can. I believe we have kept our side of the bargain. I hope you are both gentlemen of your word and ensure we stay together after our trial." Sherlock Holmes nodded his assent and Hopkins made to escort the pair out to a waiting police van. "Please," said Holmes, "just one final question. Just what was the painting that you got the money for this evening?" Alfie said, "Oh, you are a cunning one, and no doubt. Have a look for yourself under the bed." With that, they were led out. Holmes reached under the bed and pulled out a small paper-wrapped parcel. He unwrapped a painting and softly whistled. It was a very small painting of a young woman doing needlework. The work appeared of some age and quite unknown to me. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. "It is a copy of The Lace Maker by the Dutch master Johannes Vermeer," said my friend. "As you know, I have an artistic side to my family and have a knowledge of the works of great artists. Indeed, I saw this very painting exhibited in the Louvre when visiting Paris." Sherlock Holmes then chuckled to himself. "Alfie and Sam really are quite the most ingenious pair. I shall miss further pitting my wits against them." When we got back to Baker Street, Holmes explained more about Vermeer. Johannes Vermeer was a great Dutch artist of the 17th century, the Dutch Golden Age. He was virtually forgotten until art historians Gustavus Frederick Wagen and Theophil Thorbergers published an essay detailing his works just 30 years ago. It reinvigorated an appetite for his works, which are now much valued and sought after. At their trial just over a month later, Samuel Turner and Alfred Jones both received 7 years each, and Hopkins was as good as his word, ensuring the pair served their time together at Pentonville Prison. As for Holmes, he was quite taken by his little painting and hung it on the wall on his side of the fireplace. Moreover, when Inspector Lestrade would pay us a visit, I would always see him wince at the sight of it, as it served as a reminder to the adulation that had once again been poured upon Inspector Hopkins after the story of his capture of the conmen, to which the story had become a newspaper sensation. Sherlock Holmes's part in the case, as usual, had been kept as quiet as possible at his own request, and needless to say, Holmes and I enjoyed a fine belated meal at Monsieur Jonquet's restaurant.